All right, so today we are going to take just an overview look at just kind of walking step by step through writing a contract. Couple of y'all have had a little bit of experience of fumbling through your first one. And so we're going to try to just kind of answer your questions and I want to just sort of take it step by step with each form and kind of just write a sample contract as we go, explaining each little paragraph and everything. And then, y'all jump in with any questions, stuff like that. And then hopefully this will be valuable to you. And then to you later as you watch the recording or whoever else might happen to watch it. So, all right. Did y'all get the stuff I sent you last night? Sorry, that was so last minute and late. I had meant to do that a couple of days ago, so y'all have time to read through it. But I just sent you basically the blank paperwork of what we're going to go over, so that if you wanted to, you could print it out, take notes on it, fill it in, whatever, and have that as sort of your refer back to assets there. Let's see where. All right, share my screen. Share. And let's see. All right, so what I've done here is I have let me just save and close. I'm doing this in DocuSign, and it really won't matter what digital signature platform you use. I just decided, hey, I'm just going to load it in here and then I can fill everything out on here. But this is what DocuSign looks like. I'm going to go in here under manage and under drafts, because I had already this morning, I just went ahead and loaded my templates in there. So it would be ready to go for us. So I'll just open this up. And so I've got all of my documents that I sent you guys in here already. RECAD, buyer agency, the actual contract form, the personal property addendum, and then there are only two documents that EXP requires that are outside of what the Real Estate Commission requires. And those forms are the affiliated business arrangement disclosure and the wire fraud advisory. And we'll go over those, when we get to those in a minute. But everything else is the RECAD, buyer agency, the contract form, personal property addendum. Those are all parts of the contract and things that, you'll need from just a procedural standpoint, from either what AREC requires or what you need to just have a legal contract or offer. So with DocuSign, we load our documents in here, whether it's by template or uploading it from your computer just as a PDF or whatever, and you can load it in here. I've got templates set up that already have the fields set in there, which you can do in DocuSign, or you can do it in Remine, or whatever electronic signature platform you use. You can set up templates so that those fields are already there and you don't have to do that every time you go in. And you'll see that in a minute. And then I go in and I just put that Jennifer and Hallie are buyer one and buyer two. And I'm the buyer's agent. You can see that here. So, and then you just, on this particular with DocuSign, then you go ahead and put in your email information with the subject and your email message, which I just said, here's the offer paperwork for you to review and sign. Let me know if you have any questions. So you can get as detailed as you want on that. It's just like writing an email. So I'm gonna click next and go over here to, it's going to pull up our forms. So first one, and you can order these however you want to. Listen, ideally, you will have already done RECAD and buyer agency before you do a contract. We really all need to get really good with our buyers I'm not saying you have to break this paperwork out the first time you ever lay eyes on them. but pretty early in the relationship, it's a really good idea to explain to them how agency works, who represents whom, and how we get paid. And that's what these documents do. RECAD is just a disclosure of the different types of different ways that a realtor can act on behalf of a customer or client. If you are acting as an agent for that person through single agency or dual agency, they are a client. If you are just acting as a transaction broker, they are a customer and not a client. So that's where customer or client comes in. So we've got these 4 things on this RECAD form, the Real Estate Brokerage Services Disclosure. And it just explains the different ways that an agent can work on behalf of a customer or client. Our first one here is single agency. And single agency just means that you're representing only one party in the transaction. That is what happens most of the time. You're either representing the buyer or you're representing the seller. And so if you're the buyer's agent and you're representing your buyer and the house is listed with ARC Realty, well, EXP is representing the buyer, ARC is representing the seller. So it's a single agency situation where you're a single agent representing the buyer. The ARC Realty agent is a single agent representing the seller. And you can go through and read all this. I mean, it just says the single agent represents his or her client. Client can be buyer or seller. Single agent must be completely loyal and faithful to the client. Sub-agency, a sub-agent helps the agent represent the same client. The client may either be the seller or the buyer. A sub-agent must also be completely loyal and faithful to the client. Sub-agency we really don't see anymore. It's still there. It used to be the way everything worked. It used to be, prior to buyer agency going into effect, it used to be that anytime you could drive a buyer around for 6 months, get to know them, and they become part of your family, basically. But when it gets time to write an offer, you're technically representing the seller. And that was because the seller was paying the commission, and there was no such thing as a formal buyer agency at that time. And so you were always, even if you were EXP and the house was listed by ARC, you were a sub-agent of ARC Realty representing that seller in the transaction, which is weird to me, but that's the way it was. But we really don't see that one much anymore. I honestly, I've never in my 26 years had an instance of acting as a sub-agent or really seeing it done, but it's still on this form. So I try to at least just briefly explain it so people don't think I'm just skipping over something. Limited consensual dual agency is when if I, as an EXP agent, am representing a buyer and I'm writing an offer on another EXP listing, well, the same broker is representing both parties in that transaction. So that brings up limited consensual dual agency. And that just means that we still have to be, well, we'll read this. It may only be done with written informed consent of all parties. So that's why it's called limited consensual dual agency. They have to consent. So you let them know, hey, in this instance, you know, my brokerage represents both parties in the transaction. And so I'm just letting you know that, and you're going to sign this little form that says that it's okay. This type of agent must be loyal and faithful to the client, except where the duties owed to the clients conflict with one another. So that's the difference in that and single agency. So with limited consensual dual agency, it basically boils down to, if you know confidential financial information that would hurt either party's bargaining position, you cannot share that information. You have to keep it confidential. Unless you're authorized by that client to share it, you know, and honestly authorized in writing to share it. So if there's a situation to where, I mean, I use the example a lot of times, if I'm privy to the information, I'm the buyer's agent, and I find out that the seller is just in a bad situation and they're willing to let this house go and they'll sell it for $20,000 less than the asking price. Well, unless that seller has authorized me to share that information, I have to keep it to myself, because technically I'm representing both sides in that, and I can't disclose that confidential financial information. On the flip side, if I know that this buyer has been doing cartwheels ever since they looked at that house and are dying to have it and they would pay $50,000 over the list price, I can't tell the seller that, unless we're going ahead and offering 50 grand over the list price. But so it's basically in areas like that where it's confidential financial information. If there's information about the house itself, if there's knowledge of health and safety issues of the house or something, then you're required to disclose that stuff. This basically just boils down to representing your clients and holding confidential information to yourself if you're not authorized to share it. And then transact. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, so if this is one where EXP is, you're representing a buyer, you're with the EXP, the house is for sale, that's EXP.
Yeah.
But it's another EXP agent that has listed that house.
Yeah.
You're the EXP agent that's showing that house, but it's the same broker. Is
Right.
this still used because we're using the same broker for the same listing?
Right. So it applies when either you are the listing agent and you're also representing the buyer as their buyer's agent, then this would come up. But it also comes up, like you said, if you as an EXP agent are representing the buyer, let's say, Guy, you have the buyer and you show them one of my listings and we're both EXP agents, then yes, it's limited consensual dual agency because the same broker is representing both parties in the transaction.
Okay.
Now, there's a proposed change to that going before the legislature this month. Whether it passes and if it does, when it goes into effect, I don't know, but it is being proposed that they change to what's called designated broker or something like that. And so a particular agent within, like if you have that scenario where I have the listing and you have the buyer, the client can designate a certain agent to act as their single agent so you don't have dual agency, which makes sense to me because, I mean, what are the chances that I've ever met your client before and know anything about them? So it just seems kind of goofy to me, but that's just the way it's always been.
Okay, that clears it up. Thank you.
Sure. And y'all jump in with any questions you've got, on this. I'm breezing through this, but I will stop and we'll dig into questions. Transaction broker is when you are not acting as an agent for one of the parties. I would say the place that I personally have run into this most is, say I have a listing and somebody just calls me off of the sign on that listing and wants to see it. I've never met them before. I have no relationship with them, and they decide they want to buy that house. Well, I already had an existing relationship with that seller and I'm representing them. So you can do buyer's agency with that buyer, but typically what I'll do is I'll do transaction broker for that buyer and I'm an agent of the seller because I already had loyalty and fiduciary relationship in place with that seller to begin with, and I'm just facilitating the transaction for that buyer. And so what that is, if we read it, it says a transaction broker is not an agent and does not have the same obligations as an agent. The transaction broker and licensee working with him or her perform the services set out in their contract. And then you see below, it talks about Alabama law imposes the following obligations to all real estate licensees, to all parties, no matter their relationship. So whether you're limited consensual dual agency, single agency, or transaction broker or sub-agency, then all of these things apply. You have to provide services honestly and in good faith. You have to exercise reasonable care and skill, keep confidential any information gained in confidence unless disclosure is required by law or duty to a client. The information becomes public knowledge or disclosure is authorized in writing. You must present all written offers promptly to the seller and answer questions completely and accurately. Further, even if you are working with a licensee who is not your agent, there are many things that the licensee may do to assist you, the customer. So if you're a transaction broker, you can provide information about properties, show properties, assist in making offer, provide information on financing. And then it says you should choose which type of service you want from a licensee and sign a brokerage service agreement. And that would be whether it's a buyer agency agreement, a listing agreement saying that you're a single agent for them on the listing side, or transaction brokerage agreement, just stating, hey, I'm here to facilitate the transaction, but I don't represent you. The licensee's broker is required by law to have on file an office policy describing the company's brokerage services. You should feel free to ask any questions you have. So again, you see, this is just a disclosure to the customer or client that introductory to these are the types of services we offer. You have to decide, do you want me to be a single agent to you or transaction broker to you? We might run into limited consensual dual agency. If we do, I'll let you know about that. So that's what that form does. Simply a disclosure, doesn't obligate them to anything. We're supposed to have this signed, but it also is not. If you just come across somebody and you present RECAD to them and they just say, hey, I'm not signing anything, you can simply write on the bottom of it, presented to John Smith on, February 13th, 2024, refuse to sign, and keep a copy of it. And then, because they're not required to sign it, we're just required to explain it to them, if that makes sense. Having them sign it proves that we did. So it's best to have it signed if you can, but don't push somebody, because some people just feel like if I sign anything, I'm going to be obligated to this person. All right, any questions on that one before we move on? All right. So next up, we've got our buyer agency agreement. And this is what creates single agency between you and that buyer. This is your contractual agreement on how you're going to get paid and what you're going to do for them and what their obligations to you are. So it just says that the undersigned, and this is just, it'll, with DocuSign, I've got it set to where it just puts the buyer one and buyer two's full names in there when they click in to sign it. So it'll pop their names in there. My company name will pop in there. So it'll say eXp Realty LLC is the brokerage. And so the people are designating eXp Realty as client's sole and exclusive agent to locate, describe property below or other property acceptable to buyer, and to negotiate terms and conditions acceptable for buyer to purchase, exchange, lease, or option to buy, and perform the services described herein, subject to the terms and conditions of this agreement. And listen, we're going to go through this, pretty quickly, and I'm going to answer any questions you have, but I encourage y'all to read all of these documents and know what's in them, and then it just makes it easier for you to explain it. The number of agents that have put a piece of paper in front of somebody and have no clue what's in it and just ask them to sign it is just mind-blowing. They couldn't explain it if they had a gun to their head. So read it. I mean, and then if you have questions that come up, make notes and let's talk about them. So item 1 is just a description and location of the property. Buyer's general description of possible suitable properties. Well, you can get as specific and as broad as you want here. Like you can see here, if I'm working with somebody, we're just getting started and they don't know really, they got an idea of what they want, but I want my buyer agency agreement to encompass whatever we might find that maybe wasn't described by this. So I just put single family residential property there. That's what they're looking for. They just want a home. And you can do whatever. You could get as specific as you want. You could say they want a 4-bedroom, 3-bath house, in Meadowbrook, or I've had people where they've contacted me. They're really only interested in buying one specific property. I'll just put that address in there, and then they're not obligated to work with me beyond that one address. And then if it doesn't work out and they want to do something different, we can change that later. So you kind of want to read your buyer and see, one, you want to protect yourself, but 2, you don't want to force them into some relationship that they're not comfortable with either. So it's a give and take, and you can structure this however you need to. And then in the general location, like you can see here, location of property, you can get as specific as you want here, a specific neighborhood, a specific address of an area. I just put Greater Birmingham, Alabama area, because somebody sometimes might tell me they want to live in Pelham and they end up buying in Trussville, and so I want this agreement to cover whatever they might buy. And then the time, I mean, this is just giving a time frame to your agreement. You know, I usually just sort of put, I mean, you usually will put the day that you're getting it signed is the beginning date. And then continuing until I just give time beyond when I think they may close on something, because you need this agreement to be in place when it closes. So if I think they're going to buy something in the next 3 months, I might stretch this out 6 months, you know, or something like that. I mean, you can do a year if you want to, if they're going to be looking for a while. That's just up to you and what they will do. So number 3, as a buyer's exclusive agent, broker and agent representing the broker will use good faith efforts to locate and show real property as described in section 1 to buyer and provide timely information related to potential properties to buyer, negotiate terms and conditions acceptable to the buyer, and perform other related services, including serving as buyer's representative in negotiations and transactions to help buyer close the purchase or rental of real property that is subject to this agreement. Broker represents that the broker is a properly licensed broker under the laws of the state of Alabama, and the buyer represents that the buyer is not subject to or bound by any other buyer agency representation or similar agreement. Agent listed below will support broker in performance of services under this agreement. To the extent necessary, the buyer will provide reasonable cooperation when requested by the broker to facilitate broker's performance of services under this agreement. So it's just basically lining out that, you know, what you're going to do. You're going to help them locate and view properties, help them negotiate, help them get to closing, you know, all those things. So it's just detailing those services. Number 4, condition of property and necessity of inspections. In locating properties for a client, broker may rely on statements or representations of others that any given property may not satisfy all the requirements expressed by the client, and the broker makes no representation whatsoever regarding the condition of the property or suitability for the client's needs. Broker and his associates lack the expertise to determine the condition of the property, and therefore client will not rely on any statements or omissions made by broker or his associates regarding the condition of the property. We're not the home inspector. Client and not broker has the responsibility to determine or verify either personally or through other or through or with a licensed contractor or other representative of client's choosing any and all conditions of the property material to the client's decision to buy the property. So it's up to that buyer to make sure that that property is going to meet their needs, and they're not relying on you to tell them that it's going to meet their needs of whatever they plan to do with it. Client is aware that professional inspection services and or contractors may be engaged for this purpose, and that the broker and its associates strongly recommends the use of such professionals. And the client acknowledges that the client may need to consult or engage with other professional service providers to fully evaluate the potential transaction, including but not limited to attorneys, tax advisors, lenders, insurance professionals, blah, blah, blah. So this is just sort of taking the monkey off of our backs, that we're here to help you find a property, negotiate it, all those things, but we can't be experts in all these things, and you're not going to rely on us for legal and tax consequences of a transaction. You're not relying on us to be your home inspector or, you know, the pest inspector or, you know, any of those other things. Then limited consensual dual agency, which EXP does allow limited consensual dual agency. Real estate brokerage service disclosure. This is just saying that they have seen RECAD. You've presented that to them. And then broker compensation is what we're getting into next. In consideration for the services performed by the broker under this agreement, the client agrees to the following compensation structure, but in all cases is established between the broker and the client. Okay, so basically we're choosing our brokerage fees here. Are they purchasing? Is it an option to purchase? Is it a lease? Is it another arrangement? 9 times out of 10, you're doing a purchase. I guess, I mean, honestly, I don't guess I've ever done one of these for anything other than a purchase. I've helped some people find, I mean, it's just rare that I've helped anybody find a lease. You know, that's not something I get into. But if you do, you could use this also, that you are representing as their agent to help them find a lease. And for those services, they're going to pay you a fee. But most of the time you're going to be doing A1 here, which is purchase. Client agrees to pay the broker as compensation for locating property acceptable to client and negotiating the purchase a fee of blank. It can be a flat dollar amount. It can be a percentage of the purchase price, whatever you are charging as the agent. You have the freedom to choose what you're going to do there. So I've got it in here saying, hey, my fee is 3%. So we've chosen purchase. That skips these others four because it's an either or on all these options under A. So that brings us down to B, payment of fee by third parties. So you have two choices there. I've selected broker agrees that if it receives a fee or commission from the seller or the seller's broker, the fee received shall be credited against the amount owed by the client to the broker hereunder. So basically what that's saying is, Mr. Buyer, my fee is 3%. If the seller or the seller's agent is offering a compensation, whatever that is will be credited against that. So if they're only offering 2%, my fee is 3%. So that leaves that extra 1% out there for you to pay. And you can handle that however you want to. I mean, that can be, they can pay you at closing. They can pay it at closing to the brokerage, just like on the settlement statement, just like anything else. Or if it's some situation where you're like, you know what, I'm really just not going to hit this person up for the difference. It can be, whatever is being offered by so there's this other option down here that you can check. Any compensation offered, any compensation or fee accepted by broker from the seller or seller's broker will be in lieu of any obligation by the client to pay a commission or compensation as agreed above. So that one, if you select 2, would mean that if you're saying your fee is 3% and you've checked item 2 there, and that seller is only offering 1% commission to a buyer's agent, then this is saying that you are accepting whatever the seller is offering in lieu of this 3% up here. And so there is no obligation of that buyer to pay you the difference. And again, you can do that however you want. I personally always select the first one because I want it to be that it'll be credited against what I charge. And then I at least have the ability that, especially in the environment that we're in today, we really have to be able to communicate our value, and that we don't and can't work for free, just like they don't go to their job every day for free. We can't do that. And so this is what we charge. And if the seller is covering that, great. If not, I'm going to let you know before we go see the property that that seller is not offering any commission or is only offering a certain amount, and that there's going to be a gap there that's going to have to be covered. And then the buyer can decide if they want to see the house or not under those circumstances. So just something for us to be aware of, especially in our current environment with, sellers are getting more aware of these lawsuits that have happened and everything. We've had a couple that wanted to offer something different than what we might have suggested for buyer's agent compensation. And so if it's important to you to get your full fee that you charge, then this is the way you go. You put whatever you charge up there, and then you just say it will be, if the seller's offering anything, it will be credited against that. And then you have choices to make then if it's less than that. Does that all make sense?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So you have 3%, and from everything that so far that I've come across, it looks like the sellers offer 2.5, the seller's agent.
Yeah.
So more often than none,
Because you've been selling high dollar properties.
well, no, yeah. But do you, more often than none, does this buyer make up that 0.5% to you if you do it that way?
Listen, I have had instances where I've asked them to. It's rare. I mean, because honestly, in our market, I mean, you see a lot of 2.5 and you see a lot of 3. I put 3 because I want, I don't want to get into a situation. I haven't seen, it's never come up, and I've never seen it tested where I've put in 2.5 on this thing and the seller was offering 3, well, then am I obligated to give the other 0.5% back to the buyer? Or, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. So I just want it to cover, the upper end of but if I'm showing $500,000 houses and they're offering a 2.5% commission, no, I'm not going to go ask that buyer to make up that other 0.5%. I mean, it's
Yeah,
still
that was my questions. If you just
Yeah.
kind of back off that 3%, if they're
I
offering
do.
to-
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't typically do that. I want this in here to protect me, one, against we come across a for sale by owner that's just like, I'm not paying an agent's commission, or in today's current environment where, agents are not required to offer a buyer agent compensation. Now, I've not run into that yet, but I think we will see that. I think it'll be limited, but we will see some stuff go in MLS with 0 or, $1,000 as the compensation to the buyer's agent. We had one recently where
Some land.
we had one on one of our sellers that only wanted to offer 2% compensation to the buyer's agent. She was real savvy on all this stuff, and she knew that was, and we need to make sure that people are aware that is not, there's no requirement that they offer X amount to a buyer's agent. And so in that case, this seller only wanted to offer 2% buyer agency compensation.
Don't you think that if a seller starts going down that road that, I mean, I guess if you've got a client that just absolutely loves that house and wants to see it, but don't you think that if they go down that road and they start offering less than say 2.5 and go to 2, 1.5, that the buyer, doesn't it hurt the seller not to have enough buyers interested in that house?
My opinion is the free market will take care of that.
Yeah,
Because you will. I mean, and it's not about buyers agents boycotting the houses. That's not what I'm talking about. It's about, can buyers afford to come up with a big down payment, pay their closing costs, and make up the difference on whatever low commissions offered, when this system that we've been under has worked so well for a lot of years.
Yeah.
So I think it'll take care of itself. I think most sellers are savvy enough to understand that they're going to have, the market is going to respond better to their product if they are offering, a competitive compensation to the buyer's agent.
Yeah.
That's just my thoughts on it. I might be totally wrong, but that's the way I view it today. So, all right. So our next section here just says exclusive agency commission earned on completion of transaction after expiration. If your buyer client acquires property that was shown by you to the client during the period of this agreement, or within whatever number of days you put in here, 90 days, 180 days, after expiration of this agreement, the client is obligated to pay the broker the commission described herein above. If client is contacted directly by a seller or other real estate agent or broker, the client shall refer them to the broker. So basically, it's just saying if you show them a house and then they ghost you and go buy that house within whatever amount of time you put in here, they're technically still owing you that commission. And if you've shown them a house and the seller was there and they got all buddy and then the seller started calling them, after you've shown the house, they are to refer that person back to you for any, this is just kind of putting it on them that they have some obligations to you as well as you to them. So this is what gives teeth basically to our agreement. And it's a 2-part thing. Here's what I charge. And if you go buy something without me and you close on it within a certain period of time after the expiration of this agreement, then you still owe me a commission because you cut me out of, you didn't honor our agreement. I showed you the house, all the things, and you basically went around me to go buy that house without me. And I get agents a lot of times, you see people, they'll do their buyer agency agreement and they put 0 here for the commission. Or something like that. And then they get upset later and think somebody owes them something when the buyer goes and buys something without them. Well, I mean, you didn't say in here that you were owed anything. You weren't charging anything for your services, so you have nothing to fall back on. Yeah. So all this is important because it just establishes we're professionals. This is how we get paid. Affiliated business arrangements. I just put in this. It just talks about the buyer is hereby notified that the broker has a business relationship with the following companies. I just put C, affiliated business arrangement disclosure, because we have a disclosure on that just tells the different companies that EXP has a relationship with that they might get compensation. Privacy and security of policy of personal information. This is just saying that you and the brokerage are not going to share their information with anybody. Surveillance devices. Buyer is advised that homeowner may use video, audio, and other types of surveillance devices on the property which may allow for remote monitoring or recording. Buyer holds harmless and releases broker, its licensees, Greater Alabama MLS, Birmingham Association of Realtors, from liability that may result from the use of such surveillance devices. So, I mean, in this day and age, it's very important that we make sure our buyers understand you are probably being watched and recorded and listened to every time you look at a house. So be careful what you say. Non-discrimination. It's illegal to discriminate in the sale or lease of real estate because of race, color, religion, sex, handicap, familial status. I can't talk today. National origin, sexual orientation, or gender identity. Broker services to buyer are performed in accordance with state and federal law. That's self-explanatory. Severability clause. This just says if it's ever deemed that one paragraph in this document is not legal for some reason, it wouldn't nullify the whole agreement, but just that one provision. And then it just says that everything's governed by the laws in the state of Alabama. And that's pretty much it on buyer agency. So before we move into the actual offer paperwork, any questions about buyer agency? Did we kind of cover it pretty much as we went through it?
A question that we won't go through today, but just came to my thought would be, is there like a page similar to that if you're doing you're listing a house for the seller, like a seller?
Yeah, our listing agreement sets up the agency relationship and the compensation and all that sort of stuff with the seller. So we'll do that in another one. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah. We would still do recad with them. And then we would do the listing agreement that sets up that relationship, contractual relationship with them.
Gotcha.
All right, so we're going to get into our offer. And on this one, we're pretending that our buyer is just buying a normal house. So this is the general financed residential contract. This is the Birmingham Association of Realtors, or Birmingham Association of Realtors version of contract. You may have also seen, I know the state brokers teach the Alabama Association of Realtors version of the contract, and you can use either one. No listing agent can require you to use a specific form. That's not legal. So you can use whichever one you're comfortable with and familiar with. I've been using this one for years. I know the state likes teaching that one from the Alabama Association of Realtors just simply because they're dealing with a multitude of different associations across the state that each may have their own versions of contracts, and it's just easier for them to teach one version of the contract. So this is the one you see the most in our local area is this one, or some version of it. Some companies have taken it, added a couple things to it or something, but this is what would be most familiar. So I use this one. And so you'd come in here and you'd put the date of our offer. So put in today's date. The way I've got it set up is it's going to pop their names in automatically once I hit send. But otherwise, if you're filling it out, you would put the buyer's names in here. For our cases today, I've got Jennifer Beasley and Hallie Beasley as our buyers. And then you put the seller, Joe and Mary Seller. Whoops, I can't type today either. All right, so we're putting the seller's names in there. That can be, a lot of times you look at the tax record and you can find the seller's names, or sometimes what's in the tax record may not be accurate. sometimes I just leave that blank and let the listing agent fill it in so that it's the way it needs to be. Because maybe somebody's gotten a divorce and one party's out of it, or whatever, and you may not know, or it's a trust, or that's the seller or something like that. So a lot of times on the initial offer, I might leave it blank and then just call that to the listing agent's attention and go, look, I wasn't exactly sure how the seller needed to be listed, so I left that for you to fill in. You will see if you run into a relocation deal where a seller, is selling, they're relocating, and there's a third-party corporate relocation company involved. Sometimes that seller will negotiate everything, but the buyer will be listed as that relocation company because they're going to assign the property to that relocation company, and you'll actually close with the relocation company as the seller. That's getting a little bit in the weeds, but that just gives you an example of there's sometimes where the seller can be something different than what you think it might be. And let's just say we're just filling out here. Let's say the house is in Chelsea and it's 123 Grayson Place. Oh no, I'm sorry. That's our county field. Shelby County. 123 Grayson Place. And you can either, look, you don't have to go exactly by all these blanks. Like I'll put the full address here because the way I've got my template set up, that full address is mapped to some other places in other forms. So it'll automatically pop it into there instead of me having to map the address and the zip code and all the stuff. So I just leave the zip code one blank because I got it over here. But you can do it either way. You can put the address here and the zip code there, whatever you want to do. Legal description is usually like lot 4, Chelsea Park. I'm just making stuff up. Sector 5 or whatever. You pull that from the tax record, and then your tax ID is like some series of numbers, that you can pull from the tax record. Map book and page are in the tax record, but like it says here, it's the legal description and the map book and page or the completed parcel ID. So if you put one, you don't have to put the other. I usually put both. I like to, I'm weird that way. I like more information and all of that, but you can do it however. Here you're going to put the listing company. Let's say it's Realty South. God, I can't type at all. And they're acting as an agent of the seller. So we're going to check that box. This section is just disclosing who's representing whom. And then it's going to pop in EXP Realty automatically here because I've got that set up for that in my templates. If not, you would just place your field in there and put EXP Realty LLC. And we're acting as an agent of the buyer. And then this gets missed a lot because it's kind of hard to see in here for whatever reason, but you're always going to want to get that initialed right there. They're initialing that, acknowledging who's representing who in the transaction, that EXP is representing the buyer, Realty South's representing the seller. And then here's where we put our offer price. Let's say we're offering $350,000, and you have the discussion with your seller, and they just are your buyer, and they want to offer $1,500 in earnest money. That's where you put that. And then this next section talks about how we're going to buy it. Are we paying cash? Or are we doing financed? One thing to recognize on this cash clause right here, if you read it, buyer will either pay cash or obtain financing for purchase of the property, but the buyer's obligation to close this transaction is not contingent on obtaining financing or the appraised value of the property. Buyer will provide to seller a letter of deposit / financial capability to purchase within 7 calendar days from the finalized date of this contract. Finalized date shall mean the date that appears on the last page of the contract. Basically, the date that the last party to the contract puts the final signatures and initials on it. So this clause can either be cash, but I've had it trip me up before where somebody was financing. They brought me an offer on my listing, and I'm thinking I'm representing to the seller that it's cash. And then later I get a pre-approval letter. I'm like, what the heck is this? You're paying cash. They were like, no, they're not paying cash. It's just not contingent on their financing. So what that would mean is they're so confident in their financing that they're going to finance it, but they're not contingent on financing. They'll let their earnest money be at risk if the financing doesn't go through. Does that make sense? And that's a tactic you can use sometimes. If you've got a buyer that's financing and they're a very strong buyer and they have no concerns whatsoever about their financing, this might make their offer a little bit stronger because it's putting their earnest money completely at risk. There's no financing contingency or appraisal contingency. So that one's one you have to be careful with. That you need to make sure they know that if the appraisal comes in low, they're still obligated to buy it for their purchase price they put in up here if you do that. The second option would be the financing contingency. It's an either or here. You're either selecting this one or this one. So the financing contingency says the contract is contingent on the buyer obtaining approval of whichever type loan it is. Let's just say it's conventional loan in the amount of, and you can put a dollar amount or a percentage. Let's say they're putting 10% down. So we're going to say 90% of the purchase price. So we're talking about the loan amount. The loan amount is 90%. They're putting 10% down. You don't put 10% there because that would mean they're putting 90% down. So loan amount in 90% of the purchase price, excluding any finance loan costs at the prevailing interest rate and loan costs. If FHA or VA financing is utilized, the FHA VA amendatory clause addendum must be part of this contract. I didn't load that in here. If you're doing FHA or VA, there is an addendum that needs to go with it that basically just says that the house has to appraise for the purchase price. There is no obligation for them to buy the property if the appraisal is low and the seller won't come down. Any questions on those clauses at all? Okay. Next just talks about buyer will apply for financing within X number of days from finalized date and will provide any and all credit, employment, financial, and other information required by the lender. Finalized date will mean the date that appears on the last page of the contract. Unless the buyer elects to waive the financing contingency of this contract, either party may cancel this contract if the buyer cannot obtain financing as specified above by X date. Let's just say you put in there, 2/29. And that would mean if they can't produce a pre-approval letter that they've done all these things and can get acceptable financing by this term, then the either party can cancel the contract. In such event, both parties will execute a mutual release, and all earnest money will be promptly returned as per the terms stated in paragraph 5 below. No terms of the financing contingency can be changed without written authorization of the seller. This one's very important. I see this every now and then where a seller just up and changes loan type or lender or whatever from what was originally agreed to without telling the seller at all. Maybe they're switching from conventional to FHA, which is fine if everybody agrees to it. But when that change happens, if the seller doesn't agree in writing, that's grounds for the contract being terminated. Unless otherwise agreed in writing, this contract shall not be contingent on the sale or closing of any other property. So if they've got to sell another property, you've got to state that in the contract, whether another addendum or writing it in somewhere. If the purchase price exceeds the appraised value of the property, the buyer may elect to cancel this contract by providing written notice of such election to the seller within 5 calendar days of knowledge of the appraised value, along with a copy of the appraisal or evidence of the appraised value provided by the lender, unless the seller agrees to sell the property under this contract for the appraised value. Otherwise, the earnest money shall be returned pursuant to the terms of paragraph 5 below. So that makes sense. If the house appraises low, buyer has to, and I've had this question before, but it's stated right here in the contract. Yes, you have to provide. If I'm the listing agent, we're not negotiating that price based on the appraisal until you give me a copy of the appraisal. I want to see it, and the seller needs to be able to see that. And look, sometimes I've been able to dispute them and get the value up. But the buyer has no obligation to move forward with this if the appraisal is low, unless the seller agrees to sell the property at the appraised value. Now, that doesn't mean that discussions can't happen and the buyer either agrees, okay, I'll move forward and buy it anyway, or everybody agrees to, okay, it appraised 20 grand below the contract price. We'll meet in the middle, and the seller comes down 10 and the buyer ponies up an extra 10. So there's all that stuff that can happen. Lender required repairs. If the contract is contingent on buyer obtaining financing and the lender requires any repairs, this has nothing to do with your home inspection. The appraiser is the eyes and ears of the lender. If the appraiser goes out and sees conditions that have to be remedied in order for that property to meet the requirements of that loan program, this is where this comes into play. So if the contract is contingent on buyer obtaining financing, lender requires any repairs to the property as condition of the buyer's loan approval, and the seller declines to pay for the required repairs, then the buyer may cancel this contract and all earnest money will be refunded upon the execution and delivery of a mutual release. If the buyer elects to cancel the contract due to seller's election not to pay any repairs required by the buyer's lender, seller agrees to execute a mutual release authorizing return of the earnest money to buyer promptly upon receiving notice of cancellation and the mutual release. So that's just if the lender goes out. You see this more often. That you typically only see it on FHA, VA, USDA government loans. There's some rotten wood around some windows or on some trim. There's a deck that's 4 feet off the ground and it doesn't have a handrail, and they require a handrail to be placed. It's usually health and safety, or there's there's just certain minimum criteria that the property has to meet to qualify for those loan programs. And if the lender says, hey, in order for this loan to go through, the appraisal is subject to the following repairs, and those have to be completed prior to closing, and the seller says, no, I'm not doing any of that, then the buyer has an out. And in fact, the lender just won't loan the money without that being taken care of. Now, it sometimes can be dealt with if the seller just doesn't have any money. Maybe you get quotes and the seller can agree that money's going to be paid at closing to a contractor, or check's going to be cut for it to be done after closing or something. You just need to consult with the lender on how that can be handled, for that money maybe to be held in escrow or something like that for it to be done at. But typically it's done prior to closing, and the appraiser comes back to the property before it closes to inspect it again and make sure those things were cleared up. Loan closing costs and prepaid items. Seller agrees to pay up to X amount of the buyer's loan closing costs and prepaid expenses, excluding seller's half of settlement fee and title insurance costs. Buyer shall promptly deliver to real estate agent for buyer, if any, a copy of loan estimate, closing disclosures upon receipt. This is just where you would put in if you're negotiating for the seller to pay closing costs for your buyers. Let's say you're offering $350, but your buyer needs $7,500 of toward their closing costs paid, because they've got their 10% down payment, but they don't have any other money. They can't afford the closing costs, and this is the only way they can do the deal. This is where you put that in there. And it's just saying that the seller is going to pay their normal stuff, half the attorney, half the title, transfer the termite bond, things like that, whatever those normal things would be. And then in addition to those items, they're going to pay $7,500 toward your buyer's closing costs and prepaid items. And prepaid items would be things like taxes, insurance, things that go into that escrow account. So that's where, and it's important that you maybe check with your lender if you're not real confident in nailing those numbers down. And even if you are, even with me, I'm good at calculating that stuff and I can get pretty close, but I still sometimes need to talk to the lender, because one thing I don't know, especially in today's environment, we came through a period where rates were so low, nobody was paying a discount. Nobody was paying an origination fee. But you're talking a $350,000 loan, as they're putting 10% down, so that's 35 grand, $315,000 loan amount. If there's a 1% origination fee in there, well, that's $3,100, $3,150. So the difference between zero origination and 1% origination is $3,100. That's a big difference in how do you calculate how much do I need to ask for if I need to make sure that all the closing costs are covered for this buyer, because they can't do it if all the closing costs are covered. So that's when you call your lender and go, hey, I really need to nail these closing costs down. Can you help me with that? You know, maybe get a fee sheet from them of what their estimates are and kind of compare it to what you're putting in that offer and kind of calculate it to kind of get it to where you need it to be. Or you can just point blank ask them, okay, Mr. Lender, we need to make sure all their costs are covered. What number do I need to ask for? And they can kind of help you with that. So closing and possession dates, that's pretty self-explanatory. You're just choosing the date that you want to close on here. And let's say we're going to close March 15th. So March 15th, and we want possession to be delivered. Let's say we've decided we're going to give the seller 3 days after closing to get out, and we want them out by 5 p.m. On that third day. And that's how we would do that. You know, if it was going to be possession at closing, you just put 0 there, and you can either leave that blank, or a lot of times I'll just put at closing here. So that's, I mean, closing dates, you just, you know, again, if it's cash, you can close pretty quickly. It's just a matter of if they're doing an inspection, getting the inspection done and title work done. I've had them, I had one close as quickly as contract on Sunday, closed on Wednesday. I actually had a land deal, a lot one time that we went under contract one day and closed the next. But that was very unusual. Usually for a cash deal, it's going to be at least 2 weeks because you need time. They want to do an inspection, you know, title work needs to be finished up, all that sort of stuff. For a finance deal, you're usually looking at about 30 days, sometimes 45, you know, so you might want to check with your lender, especially if there's holidays in play in that period, of just checking with the lender and go, hey, we're about to make an offer. We're thinking about closing on this date. Do you feel like you can comfortably meet that date? So, you know, if you're concerned about it, check with the lender and make sure they can pull it off. So that's pretty much it on that paragraph. This just says our dates and times are of the essence. Closing date and other dates and times identified in this agreement are of the essence and binding. The finalized date of the contract is the date buyer and seller have indicated full acceptance of the contract. So it's basically just saying all the dates are firm. If no date can be changed, like the contract doesn't live on past the close date unless all parties agree in writing to change that and extend it. And that's basically what this says. And then we get into our earnest money section. And it just talks about that the pre-printed time frame in here y'all need to be aware of. Within 3 days of the finalized date of this contract, the buyer shall deliver to whoever's going to be holding the earnest money, which shall be promptly deposited into an escrow account. So if you're working with the buyer, make sure they understand this, that within 3 days of the finalized contract date, if they have not gotten that earnest money to you to deliver it, or they've delivered it or whatever, they're in breach of this contract. So it's important that they know those dates and they're not just sitting there. And if they need longer, that's okay, as long as everybody agrees to it. Just write something in somewhere that, you know, if the buyer's here from out of state and they don't have any checks with them and they go to contract and they need to get home and mail a check back, you know, or something like that, just tell the seller, you know, the listing agent what's going on, make sure the seller's aware. If they're cool with it, just write it in, you know, seller will overnight a check back, and, you know, it will be here by the 20th, or, you know, whatever the date is. As long as it's in there, it's fine. Should buyer fail to deliver the earnest money within 3 days of finalized date, guess what? Seller may void this contract at the sole option of the seller. So I've heard of this happening. Buyer's sitting there, they haven't delivered the earnest money. On day 1 or 2, where they still got time to get it there, seller gets another offer that's better. They sit there and wait it out. Day 3 passes, the seller cancels this contract so they can take the better one, all because they didn't deliver the earnest money. So It's important stuff. If the contract is accepted and signed by all parties and the sale does not close, a separate mutual release signed by all parties to this contract will be required before earnest money will be dispersed. So no one party ever automatically gets the earnest money. It's a matter of everybody has to agree in writing where it's going. Or if they can't or won't, then it just sits there with whoever's holding it, whether it's closing attorney or the other brokerage. It'll sit in that account until either both parties agree in writing how it's being split up, or one party or the other interpleads it into small claims court and the judge issues an order on who it goes to. So make sure that your buyer is aware that, earnest money is a tricky thing. You want to offer enough earnest money that it makes you look serious, but at the same time, you don't want to put so much money out there that's tied up that if something goes south and the seller just decides to make your life difficult and won't sign the release, and you got to jump through a bunch of hoops to get it back, and it puts you in a bind to get it back, you don't want to have $100,000 sitting out there, so it's just a kind of a dance to think through what makes sense on all of that. So that's essentially what that paragraph says. Any questions on that one? There are some changes proposed in the legislature on earnest money too right now, of requirements of like on the listing side of, not only like right now, we typically just get a copy of the check. Well, that doesn't tell me that check's been deposited. So I've started, because I know this change is coming in the future, asking for proof from the whoever's holding the earnest money. I want proof of deposit from them, of just telling me, yes, it's been deposited, and not just a copy of the check from the other agent, that check might still be in that agent's glove compartment or something. Title insurance. This just says that seller agrees to furnish the buyer a standard Alta form owner's title insurance policy at the seller's expense, issued by a company qualified to insure titles in Alabama, in the amount of the purchase price, insuring the buyer against loss on account of any defect or encumbrance in the title, subject to the exceptions herein, including paragraphs 8, 13C below. Otherwise, the earnest money will be refunded. That means if they can't get clear title to insure it, then, the deal doesn't have to go through. In the event both owners and first mortgage title policies are obtained at the time of closing, the total cost of the two policies will be divided equally between the buyer and the seller, even if the mortgagee is the seller. Seller shall have until the closing date within which to perfect title or cure defects to the title to the property. Should seller be unable to perfect title or cure defects in the title to the property by the closing date, the contract shall be voidable at the option of the buyer. So that's pretty self-explanatory. They've got until closing to get, everything cleaned up, to get clear title if there's any issues there. Listen, it's important as the buyer's agent. I, on my listings, always order preliminary title as soon as it's listed, just so that I know up front if there's any issues there we need to clear up. But not everybody does that. So it's important pretty quickly, once you've gone to contract, or maybe even before you go to contract, ask the agent, hey, have you ordered preliminary title? Is everything clean there? Ask for a copy of the title. And, within a day or two after it's gone under contract, maybe, find out who's doing the title, who the listing agent's ordering title from, and maybe go ahead and request a copy of that if they don't send it to you automatically. Because if they wait till a week before closing to order title, and then there's some issues there that need to be cleaned up, it could cause you problems. So that's just a little side note to kind of be aware of those things. Prorations. This just talks about prorating things like the buyer and seller will split up, HOA dues, property taxes, things like that, based on the portion of the year that each has owned or is going to own the property. Some things are paid in arrears, some are paid in advance, and they'll just get prorated out at closing. This paragraph also talks about seller represents and warrants that the property is or is not currently subject to Class 3 homestead residential property tax. If the seller represents that the property is classified as class 3, meaning that they have the homestead exemption in place, which gives you a discount on the taxes, and this representation is in error, then the seller will reimburse the buyer any additional property tax for the current year, which is in excess of that which would be due had the property been class titled as class 3. This obligation will survive closing and delivery of the deed. So here's where you just check whether it is or is not subject to homestead exemption. If you know that it is, you can check it. If you're not sure that it is, and you're just making the offer, you can check it. And maybe if the seller doesn't see it, and it happens to not be homesteaded, then that triggers this where they will reimburse the buyer at closing for the difference between the homestead and non-homestead. But most of the time, if a seller knows it's not homesteaded, they're going to check that it is not, so that they're not obligated to pay any difference. That can be a big deal in some of our higher tax rate areas, Vestavia, Mountain Brook. I mean, you talk about the difference between, taxes being, $4,500 for the year, and then they're $9,000 for that first year until they can get the homestead exemption filed, because it doesn't change in the middle of the year. They have to wait till the beginning of the next tax year for that change to go into effect. Well, the lender's going to calculate their payment based on what those taxes are right now, and it can cause problems with your debt to income ratios. So that's important stuff to be aware of. Conveyance. Typically, seller agrees to convey the property to buyer by, typically it's going to be a general warranty deed. That is the broadest type of deed that's going to kind of cover searching further back and everything. There are other types. Sometimes if you're doing a foreclosure, it's just going to say special warranty deed typically, because they're not insuring anything beyond when they took possession of the property. There's something called a statutory warranty deed. I won't get into all of that today, but the general warranty deed is what you're going to see most often. And that's just what kind of deed they're going to get. Then you're also going to check 9 times out of 10, if it's a husband and wife buying a property, they're going to check this box saying that they desire that the title be held as joint tenants with right of survivorship. And what that means is if they own it together, if one of them passes away, at the blink of an eye, the other one automatically owns it without having to go through probate or anything like that. And be free of all encumbrances except permitted in this contract. Seller and buyer agree that any encumbrances not herein accepted or assumed may be cleared at the time of closing from the sales proceeds. The property is sold and is to be conveyed subject to any mineral or mining rights not owned by the seller. It's very rare that a seller owns any of the mining rights or mineral rights. Buyer is responsible for determining that the zoning is suitable for the buyer's intended use of the property. So that's all pretty self-explanatory. Hazard insurance. This just is hazard insurance, same thing as homeowners insurance. Just says that the buyer understands that they're responsible for securing acceptable hazard insurance on the property at a premium rate acceptable to the buyer. Buyer shall obtain evidence of insurability at an acceptable premium rate within X number of days. This is important, especially in today's environment. You see maybe a house has had a big claim against it. And then so because of that, that house is going to have a higher insurance rating on it. Or maybe it's in a flood zone and they don't know it, and then the flood insurance is going to be high. Well, they need to determine this early on so it doesn't blow the deal up at the end when everybody's already got their stuff on a moving truck. We know about it early on and can take care of that, in the early days of it going under contract. So I usually put 7 days because it just doesn't take that long to get a homeowner's insurance quote. And if the contract is canceled, earnest money will be returned pursuant to paragraph 5 above. Failure to notify the seller of the buyer's election to cancel within said time period shall conclusively be deemed acceptance of any available insurance. So if they don't check on it and you go beyond that time frame, it's basically the buyer saying, "Hey, I'm buying the property no matter what the insurance costs." This is really a big deal when you get down near the coast. I mean, those insurance rates have gotten sky high. So Then we get into buyer's duty to inspect. The buyer acknowledges and agrees that Alabama law imposes a duty on the buyer to thoroughly inspect the property for conditions of property defects or other relevant matters prior to the closing of the sale. Buyer further acknowledges that professional inspection services and or contractors may be engaged for this purpose, and that the real estate brokers and agents strongly recommend the use of such professionals, but endorse none of them. You can recommend home inspectors. The general consensus from a risk management standpoint is to give more than one. To give them a list of a few to choose from or something maybe. So you can recommend, but just you want to make sure they understand you're not endorsing any of these guys, that, you're just making recommendations of here are some that have done good work for my clients in the past or something. Buyers encouraged to engage and pay for independent professional inspection services rather than using previous inspection reports provided by a seller, or allowing the seller to pay for such inspection reports, or using an inspector recommended by the seller. You can deduce why that all could be a bad idea. The buyer wants those inspectors working for them. If the seller's paying for it, that inspector's working for the seller. Real estate broker and agents do not warrant, guarantee, or endorse any particular professional inspection service or contractor. Buyer understands and agrees that the buyer will not rely and has not relied on any statements or omissions made by the real estate broker and or agents regarding the condition of the property. Buyer further understands that if the real estate broker's agents or representative is present at or accompanies the buyer on an inspection of the property, it will be as a courtesy and not as a person qualified to detect any defects. After closing, all conditions of the property are the responsibility of the buyer. Especially with first-time home buyers, they need to be aware of that one. Hey, you're doing your due diligence, you're doing an inspection, you're doing all the things. If 3 days after closing, the air conditioner goes out, it's your house at that point. It sucks, but it's yours. There's no obligation for the seller to come back and fix something. Now, if there's something that goes wrong and it's blatant that this was a known problem, and maybe it falls under some health and safety issue that the seller should have disclosed, then when people start asking you about those kind of things, you're getting into legal issues there. And so after closing with stuff like that, I'll try to help fill things out, but at some point you draw the line and go, look, this is really a legal issue and it's above my level of expertise and licenses and all the things. So you really need to talk to an attorney about that. But somebody would have to be able to prove, is my understanding, that seller had knowledge of something that they had a duty to disclose under the law and didn't before they would have, but that doesn't mean somebody can't sue somebody over just about anything these days. And then we get into condition of the property. Neither broker or real estate agents makes any representations. Buyer has obligation to determine any and all conditions of property material to the buyer's decision to buy the property, including but not limited to general home inspections and all these other different types of inspections that they list here. And so then we get into the different clauses here. We can buy the property not contingent on inspections, no repairs requested, as is. So if somebody's already checked it out and they feel comfortable and confident with it and don't intend to do any inspections or ask for any repairs, they can select A. That's pretty rare. Most people want to do an inspection, so that would trigger number 11B here, which is that the sale of the property is contingent upon an inspection. The buyer's reserving the right to conduct any inspections of the property at the buyer's expense, so something that the buyer pays for a period of X number of days. If you're really trying to get one and you need to shrink that time period, you can put 5 days or 3 days, but you better be sure you can get somebody in there that quick. I usually, as a default, I've got 7 days in there. And that's calendar days. That's not business days. Now, you can change it to business days if you need to, if you're in a holiday period or something, or it's really busy and it's hard to get an inspector, then you might change that, to give yourself a little bit more time. So 7 calendar days from the finalized date of the contract. Buyer and seller acknowledge that the wood infestation inspection septic and sewer system inspection and survey do not fall under this inspection period and may be performed in accordance with paragraph 13. Seller agrees to ensure all utilities at the property shall be connected and active during the inspection period. The inspection period shall not start until all utilities are connected and active at seller's expense. No later than 3 calendar days after the end of the inspection period, buyer shall provide seller with a written list of items requested by the buyer to be repaired at the seller's expense, or the buyer shall provide notice that the condition of the property is acceptable and no repairs are required. In the event that the buyer provides notice that the repairs are requested, any such request for repairs shall be governed by paragraph 12. Failure of buyer to provide a list of requested repairs no later than 3 calendar days after the end of the inspection period shall constitute a waiver of this inspection contingency. So basically, you got 7 days from the finalized contract date or whatever date you put in here, but for the terms of, for this offer we're writing today, 7 days from the end of that period to have your inspection done. Then once the inspection's done, you have 3 calendar days, not from when the inspection was done, but from the end of that inspection period. Does that make sense? Our old contracts used to be from the date of the inspection, the report is received or whatever, but that got dicey of when did they receive it and all that. So they changed it. And now it's 3 calendar days from the end of the inspection period. So if you have a 7-day inspection period and you get the inspection done on day 2, well, you really have a full 10 days to get something to them in writing. Now, there's rarely a reason to take that long, but just so that you're clear on it, you have, that's how the contract reads unless you change something. Item 12 says if the buyer makes a written request of the seller to correct any unsatisfactory conditions revealed from the inspections, seller will respond to the buyer by written notice delivered to the buyer within 3 calendar days of receipt of such requests as to whether the seller is willing to correct those things. If they don't respond in writing within that time frame, then they're basically saying, okay, we'll fix whatever you just asked for. And then down here, item B says if the seller elects not to correct any of the conditions, the buyer will respond to the seller by written notice delivered to the seller within 2 calendar days if they're going to go ahead with it or not. So does that all make sense? You get your inspection done, you submit your request for repairs. Under item A, the seller has 3 days or whatever you put in there, but 3 days to look at that and respond. If they respond with anything other than, yes, we'll fix everything, then the buyer has 2 days to decide, are we going to move forward with this or not? And if the seller just lets that 3 days expire and doesn't respond, then it shall conclusively be deemed acceptance of the buyer's request if the seller fails to respond in writing within the time frame stated herein. So it's real important to pay attention to the time frames. As a buyer's agent, you're writing the offer. So make sure that you and your buyer are aware of the time frames and stay within them. That drives me crazy when, as a listing agent, when a buyer's agent brings me an offer and then they don't honor the time frames that they wrote in the thing in the first place. We didn't come up with the time frames, you did, and you didn't honor them. So be aware of those things. Item C says it shall conclusively be deemed acceptance of the property, including ordinary wear and tear until the closing, if the buyer fails to notify the seller in writing of any unsatisfactory conditions in accordance with paragraph 11B, or fails to notify the seller in writing of his election to terminate the contract. So that's just saying if you do your inspection, you let all the time frames expire, and you don't ask for anything, then you have accepted the house as it is because you didn't ask for anything during the time frame that was allowed. And then we've got a note here that's important for everybody to know. Ordinary wear and tear, as used in the paragraphs above, shall not be deemed to include material failure of heating, cooling, plumbing, and electrical systems or built-in appliances. If such a system or appliance suffers material failure after acceptance under paragraphs 11B and 12, but prior to closing, seller shall pay for any repairs required to restore the system or appliance to an operating condition at least as good as previously existing. After closing, all conditions of the property are the responsibility of the buyer unless otherwise stated in this contract. So just because an inspection's out of the way and, you know, we are coasting on toward closing doesn't mean that if oh, well, they've already done the inspection, the air conditioner went out. So sad, that's their problem. So that those things are covered under this ordinary wear and tear. The ordinary wear and tear doesn't mean if one of these essential systems of the house breaks down, they're to be delivered in working order at closing. So I've had that come up with stuff before with, you know, a plumbing leak that came up or something like that. And it's just, you know, you have to, I mean, I just had one. The seller, you know, it was cool. They didn't fight it, but we'd already had the inspection. Everything was cool. Seller had just asked for the HVAC systems to be serviced and checked by a licensed HVAC technician prior to closing. They weren't living in the house, and we send somebody out there, and lo and behold, the upstairs heat pump, the compressor had gone out. So that was discovered. They didn't even know about it, but the seller understood and was willing to fix it, and we got it fixed, and all was good. So item 13, this one confuses some people. Additional inspections. This does not encompass any and all additional things you might want to check out that you could possibly conceive. It covers 3 things. Additional inspections set forth in this paragraph shall be completed by, and you can put a date in here, which I have a typo in my little thing here. Let me change that. 10 days prior to closing, and any requested repairs as a result of these inspections shall be made in writing by the seller. And I just put 2 days after inspection. Should buyer fail to timely notify the seller in writing, again, it's deemed acceptance of the property. So these include 3 different areas. Termite and or wood infestation / fungus inspection and report. So your pest inspection does not fall under the time frame of your general inspection. It falls under these additional inspections. Also, then it talks about, you know, who's going to pay for wood infestation report and the transfer of the termite bond or getting a new one. And you can check yes or no whether the buyer wants a wood infestation report, and yes or no on do they want a termite bond and who's paying for that. Second item B here is the sewer and septic inspections. You're going to mark whether it is connected to sewer or not. Let's say that this one, I should have been checking all this stuff going through. Let's see. So wood infestation report, typically you're going to say yes, and it's pre-printed that the buyer is paying for the wood infestation report. That's an inspection. So typically the buyer is paying for the inspection. Termite agreement. Yes, we want one. We want it. It says that the agreement shall be transferred at the seller's expense. If a new agreement is required, the cost will be at the seller's expense. So we want that termite bond to be paid for by the seller. That's typical. Again, if you're in a competing situation and you want to just kind of make everything really sweet for the seller, you could say that the buyer is going to pay for that. That's just what's customary. Item B, sewer and septic systems. We're going to say this one is connected to a sewer. Seller has paid all impact and connection fees. That typically only applies to new construction, really, because that's only done one time. If the property is not on sewer, the seller represents that the property, and you'd say is or is not connected to a septic system. So it's not on a septic system, it's on sewer. So I'm just not going to mark anything there. And then the buyer requires a sewer / septic system inspection at buyer's expense. And you can say yes or no. We'll just say, let's say we're doing yes. I see that more in, let's say, Homewood or Vestavia, older houses that maybe have the old clay pipe, sewer pipe that goes from the house to the street, and somebody wants to run the camera and make sure that's clear. But I do see it sometimes on newer stuff too. I'm seeing it more often than I used to. But that's up to your seller, up to your buyer of whether that's something that's important to them that they want to have done. And so, and then also the survey would fall under additional inspections. So if we want a survey, we're going to say yes. As far as we know, it is not located in a floodplain. So under additional inspections that we're going to get all this done at least 10 days before closing or whatever time frame you put in there. You want to put enough time that there's time after the general inspection's done to get these things done. because some of these are things you don't really, until you know that the inspection, the general inspection is good, you really don't want to start spending somebody's money on things that if it blows up over the home inspection, then you're spending money on these other things. So those are the things, the termite wood infestation report, sewer and or septic inspections, and the survey are regulated by that additional inspections clause in item 13. So any questions there? All right. Buyer acknowledges that all inspections are the responsibility of the buyer, including payment for the inspection services. I think this should probably be highlighted. Unless otherwise agreed, buyer shall be responsible for payment of inspection services regardless of whether or not the transaction contemplated herein proceeds to closing. So that's just saying, hey, I might help you line some of this stuff up. I might give you, but at the end of the day, I might even order, something for you. But at the end of the day, you, Mr. Buyer, if this doesn't close, you're on the hook to pay for these inspections. I mean, nobody's going to do a survey and just because it didn't close, not want to collect their money. They've done the work. So, hazardous drywall. This is just a disclosure saying that this tainted wallboard often gives off a foul odor, corrodes copper, electrical wiring, metal surfaces. Brokers and agents recommend the buyer request the home inspector to inspect for this drywall problem or hire an inspector specifically trained in discovering defective drywall if property was either built or renovated since 2001. We're not seeing much of that. I'm not saying there's none of it out there. We're not seeing a lot of it anymore. Most of it's been remedied, but I mean, it's just people ask me about this sometimes, and I just tell them ask their home inspector. If their general home inspector suspects that there might be a problem, and if they don't test for it, they may know what steps they need to take from there to get it tested for that. If the property was built prior to 1978, that's where you would check yes or no on lead paint disclosure being required. For these purposes, I'm going to say no, but if it was, then so the listing agent is required by our MLS in the document section in MLS, a signed lead paint disclosure should be uploaded in there that you can download and get your buyer to initial and sign. And the seller is going to, on that form, have said whether they have any knowledge of lead paint, if there's any documentation on any of that and all that sort of stuff. And that's where the buyer can opt to have a lead paint inspection if they wanted to. I've never had anybody do it. Number 16 just says that the buyer and seller hereby agree and acknowledge that the buyer will be solely responsible for obtaining all records and information regarding property relative to zoning, subdivision regulations, restrictions, covenants, historic district regulations, HOA requirements, all of that stuff. Number 17, buyer and seller agree that the buyer is solely responsible for determining school zoning of the property. Those things are things that I try to tell people if it's something that's really important to them, I want them to check it out independently and not rely on me or what the listing agent put in MLS. I had one time that not on the school zone side of it, but like septic and sewer. It was represented by the listing agent originally when these people bought the house that it was on sewer. We didn't know any different. These people bought it. Then I later sold it and I marked it that it was on sewer. A couple of years later, they started having a problem and figured out that it was on septic tank. I ended up paying $1,200 for a repair just to keep everybody happy. But with the caveat that they signed something stating that they were aware it's on septic tank. That $1,200 was the end of it and absolved me and my brokerage of any and all liability for that going forward, because that was the only way we were, I was writing a check. So you have to be careful relying on the statements of others and making sure. And even in that situation, the home inspector had noted that it was on septic tank. There's just some areas that I just didn't have any reason to know one way or another. It was an area where you have some places that are septic and some that are sewer. And I relied on what the previous listing agent had said when I shouldn't have. And that's what happened. So school zones, satisfy yourself. Number 18, buyer will satisfy himself that fire, smoke, and gas detectors are up to code. I just tell everybody that's something your home inspector is going to comment on. if
Yeah.
that's all like it should be. Now, listen, current code on smoke detectors is different than it was even 10 years ago. So you're going to have it written up sometimes, but it's hard to get a seller to go back and bring a house up to code that was built under a different code at a different time. So those are just discussions that you have with your buyer. Here we're going to check whether we do or do not want a home warranty policy issued by a company qualified for a 1-year home warranty to be paid by buyer or seller. Say we're going to ask the seller to provide a home warranty not to exceed $750. And then the buyer can pick which company, and you order it prior to closing, give them the closing information. They send the bill to the closing attorney and it gets collected from the seller at closing. And
Is
look, I'm sorry.
Is that, so usually the seller will pay if you want that home warranty?
I will say prior to the past 2 or 3 years when things got so competitive and people quit asking for them because it just they wanted their offer to be as competitive as possible, then yes, it was almost a given that the seller was always going to get asked for a home warranty, and it was done on most deals. Especially with your younger buyers, first-time home buyers, where they're getting into a home for the first time. There's just those unforeseen things that might break down. And it just gives them peace of mind that if 3 months into it, the air conditioner goes on the fritz. I mean, that compressor that just broke down on that one I was telling you about, it was $2,900 just to replace the compressor.
Yeah.
And so if you've got a warranty in place with, say, it's got a $75 or $100 trade call fee on it,
Yeah.
depending on the level of coverage, they may only have to pay $100 and the warranty company fix it versus having to come up with $3,000.
Yeah.
So it's a good thing for some people. You just have to weigh out whether it's important to your buyer or not. And even if the seller's not paying for it, you don't even have to put it in the contract. If the buyer wants one and they want to pay for it, you can just order it and have it done at closing.
Okay.
It is important that you do it at closing though, because if you wait until after closing, if it's not done through a real estate transaction, then when they go to put a warranty on it, there's going to be a 30-day waiting period before the coverage goes into place.
When things will happen, probably.
Yeah. Yeah. So you can't wait until something breaks and then put a warranty on it. So, seller is warranting that they have not received notification from any lawful authority regarding assessments, pending assessments, condemnation proceedings, public improvements, all the things, so that's just stating that the seller's just saying, hey, we haven't received a letter from the homeowners association saying there's going to be an assessment, to everybody. Or you see this in gated communities sometimes where maybe there's road repairs that are being done and they're not public roads, so all the homeowners have to pony up to fix the roads or something. Or, you have sometimes where there's, things with cities or, whatever, but I'd rarely run into that, but it's just something to be able to explain. Final walkthrough. Buyer has the obligation to conduct a final walkthrough to inspect the property prior to closing to determine if the items to be repaired by the seller under our inspection, our repair agreement under item 2B, have been satisfied. If the buyer determines any of the following: A, the condition under paragraphs 2B and 12 has not been satisfied, or B, systems as described in the note portion of paragraph 12 are not functioning. That's those, the plumbing, electrical, HVAC, things like that. Something's broken, since then. Or new defects have arisen since buyer's acceptance of the property under paragraph 12, then the buyer shall immediately notify the seller. If the seller refused to pay for any repairs or correct any defects requested by the buyer may proceed with the closing or cancel the contract and recover earnest money, or elect to pursue remedies that the buyer may have at law or equity for seller's alleged breach of seller's obligations under the contract. If the buyer conducts this walkthrough inspection, seller's obligation, if the buyer fails to conduct this walkthrough inspection, this is important. So if your buyer does not do a walkthrough, seller's obligation will be deemed fulfilled. Buyer understands that if a real estate agent accompanies buyer on an inspection or walkthrough of the property, it will be as a courtesy and not as a person qualified to detect any defects. After closing, all conditions of the property are responsibility of the buyer. So the final walkthrough is basically one, if you've agreed on any repairs, it's an opportunity to make sure those were done and they were done properly. Two, to make sure something that has to be, that doesn't fall under that ordinary wear and tear thing hasn't broken down. And then three, just to make sure something major hasn't happened that nobody's aware of. This is not a time to do a whole new inspection. This is just, hey, we're basically making sure that the house is generally in the same condition it was when we went to contract, and or if we've agreed that repairs are being made, those have been done. So I did have one time where they went to the walkthrough. It was pouring down rain. I was walking into the closing attorney's office and the agent called me and the roof had started leaking and there was a leak in the bathroom. We were able to get somebody over there to get it fixed pretty quickly, but it's just stuff like that that would, constitute something that the seller needs to take care of, but this isn't an opportunity to go through and pick the house apart again. But it is very important to do those walkthroughs because buyers chooses not to do a walkthrough and then they call you after closing going, hey, they did this or they did this or something's not working or whatever. They really don't have a legal leg to stand on because they didn't go do a walkthrough. And it gets tricky when you're doing a walkthrough on somebody where the seller's maybe not given possession until 3 days after closing. You still need to do that walkthrough. And you're sort of trusting that the seller is going to leave the house in good condition and clean when they leave, but that's a little bit of a gamble. This paragraph, buyer and seller acknowledgements, just agreeing that the buyer and seller have not relied on the advice or representation of any other real estate companies or their agents regarding the property, including but not limited to the condition of the systems, blah, 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 blah. Just basically, again, stating that we, as their agents, are not their home inspector, we're not their accountant, we're not their attorney, all of those things. There are professionals to do those jobs if there are concerns that they're not relying on us for that kind of stuff. Number 23, risk of loss, just says that the seller will keep homeowner's insurance on the property up through closing. Once it closes, it's the responsibility of the buyer to have their own insurance in place. If it's financed, you can be guaranteed that the lender will not let it close without insurance in place. If it is cash, make sure they remember to get insurance. I've had people forget to do that before. And then number 24 just states that the closing of the transaction will be conducted by a closing attorney or a title insurance company, and the buyer and seller either do or do not agree to share that cost at closing. Typically, you do share that. Buyer and seller acknowledge and agree that sharing may involve potential conflict of interest, and they may be required to execute an affidavit. It's just basically if you're splitting the cost. Really, the closing attorney is there to make sure all the documents are done properly they're acting as an agent of the title insurer to make sure that the title is transferred properly and cleanly. And they're also acting as an agent of that mortgage company to make sure all their documents are done properly. They're not representing one party over the other. Number 25, any personal items remaining in the property shall be at no additional cost and shall not add value to the property. Shall be in as-is condition with no warranties unless otherwise agreed herein, shall be unencumbered at the time of closing, and shall be only that which is currently on the premises and on an itemized list or addendum attached hereto. So it's just basically saying the personal property, the patio furniture that they asked for out back and the refrigerator in the garage that's staying and all that stuff is in as-is condition. Number 26, other offers while buyer's offer is pending. So sometimes buyers think that, well, I got my offer in first. Well, it doesn't matter. The seller has the right to review all offers. And if your offer comes in and it hasn't been agreed upon in writing yet, and other offers come in, well, then the seller has the right to review all those offers and choose which one they want to work with. So that's just putting that in writing and disclosing that and make sure that your buyer understands that. Number 27 just says that if we use fax or electronic signatures, which we do quite often, that is all okay. And that is the same as using a wet signature in person. Number 28 just talks about the obligation for fees and expenses. that if say a buyer pays for a home inspection and they forked out $500 for the home inspector and then the deal goes south and it doesn't close, they're still obligated for that expense. Nobody's going to reimburse them for those things. Additional provisions. This is where we're going to put any addendums we're going to tie those addendums to the contract. So I'm going to go ahead and put addendum A in here because I know I have a personal property addendum back here that I'll call addendum A. So that's just tying that to this contract and just saying when you're looking at just this document, it helps you to know, hey, there's another piece somewhere in case it's missing. Number 30 just says that what is here in writing constitutes the entire agreement. Basically, if it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. If the buyer and seller got together and talked about some stuff and it's not in this agreement, this is just saying that there are no side deals, no side agreements outside of this written agreement here. And then for number 31, additional provisions, you've got on these 2 pages, you've got some blank space where you can write in additional provisions. I've started putting this in here just as a standard thing that just basically says if the home inspection covered under item 11B of this agreement reveals conditions that are unsatisfactory to the buyer at the buyer's sole discretion has the right to terminate this agreement and receive a full refund of the earnest money deposit. This right must be exercised in writing within the timeframes allowed by item 11B of this agreement. And what that does, so the way 11B reads is if you really look at it, the buyer can't just walk away after the inspection. They have to ask for things and then and then the seller refuse before they have a right to walk away. Sometimes there are things that are just so big or there's so many things to avoid having to go through the exercise of basically asking the people to rebuild the house and forcing them to say no. I put this in here so that the buyer just has the right of, hey, if there's just a bunch of junk we're not comfortable with, we can get out. So. And then you can put other things here, like if it's contingent on selling another house, you can write that in here. There is a contingent on sale addendum that sets forth a break clause and all that sort of stuff. And you could put that in there and then just say addendum B, or, if there's any number of things that could be written in these blanks of things that you would just be adding to it. And then of course you've got where they're going to sign it. You've seen the initials all throughout where you want to get everything initialed. Whoever's, once the earnest money's been delivered, you can get this filled out just as an acknowledgement. If the other agent has received it, they can fill that out, or they can just send you something from their office or something acknowledging receipt of the earnest money. And then either agent can sign this, just basically putting the finalized date in here, whatever date was the last date somebody signed, and then you can just sign it saying, that this is officially our finalized date. And then you don't have to go hunting for it and trying to figure out when did we finalize this thing when you're, a week past it and you can't remember what day it was. So here I'm going to pop in, I called this addendum A, but it doesn't say that. So I'm going to put that label on here and call this form addendum A. So this is our personal property addendum, which a lot of times you'll have in here. And it's just got standard pre-filled items on here. As to say, we want the window treatments to stay, window treatment hardware, light fixtures, ceiling fans, stove, dishwasher. Are you asking for the refrigerator? Or not? Most of these things stay automatically for the most part. Are we asking for the refrigerator or not? Garage door openers, if that applies, bathroom mirrors. This particular form has mirrors on there again. I don't know why, so I just crossed that out so it's not confusing. And then you could add in other things, patio furniture on the back deck, the gas grill, I don't know, washer and dryer, whatever else they're asking for there, and check that it remains. You can go over here under exclusions, and if you say window treatments, you could write in, blinds only are going, only blinds will stay or something if there are, or excludes fabric drapes or something like that. If light fixtures, if there's one in the dining room that the seller's great grandma gave them and they want to take it with them, you could write in there excludes the dining room light fixture or something. So, and then get that signed. And then we get into, this is our EXP form, which, doesn't have to go when you're when you write your offer and you're sending it to the listing agent for them to consider it, you really only have to send the contract document and any related addenda to that, your personal property addendum. You know, if there were a lead paint addendum, if you do, there is just a blank addendum form if you don't have enough space on those additional provision spots that you can fill out another addendum. Any of those things is what you would send. You don't need to send your RECAD and your buyer agency, and net sheet is something we'll get into later. That's something that you need to do with every offer, and every counter offer is doing a net sheet. And I will do a separate thing on net sheets, or estimated cash to close is what it really is for buyers. But this is an EXP specific form. It's just disclosing that EXP has a business relationship with the following companies listed below. Success Lending is a lender that EXP has an indirect ownership interest in. And talks about Success World Holdings, which is owned by EXP, owns 50% of Success Lending, blah, blah, blah. EXP Realty also has business relationships with, but no ownership interest in, America's Preferred Home Warranty, Transactly, which is a real estate transaction coordinator service, Sky Slope, and, so it's just disclosing those relationships. So I always present this one as, hey, this is just disclosing companies that EXP has a business relationship with. I like to use local lenders, so you're never going to see Success Lending. I just have to get this signed for our file. So I've never had anybody really question that. So, and it goes in to talk about estimated charges that Success Lending charges to show that they're on par with other lenders and all that sort of stuff. But again, it's not anything that we really see much. So you just get them to sign that one. And then this last one is the wire fraud advisory notice. This is just basically a big flashing warning to your buyers. Sellers too, if they ever need to wire money, but because we use this on that side too. But just basically saying be very careful when wiring money. There have been a lot of instances of fraud, of emails getting hacked, to where maybe a buyer gets an email from what looks like it's your closing attorney, saying, hey, we've changed our bank this week. We need you to wire your funds for closing to this bank account information. And then it turns out to be fraudulent, and the money disappears and it's gone forever. So I tell people, if they ever get wiring instructions from me, if they see an email from me with wiring instructions, go ahead and call the FBI, because I'm never going to send you wiring instructions. So it's always a good idea just to put them directly in contact by phone with whoever the closing attorney, closing office, title company is, for them to talk to them directly and get those wiring instructions. And then when they go to the bank to have those funds wired, have the teller call the place that it's being wired to and verify those wiring instructions again. So anyway, this is just a form covering our backsides saying, hey, we've told you, be really careful in wiring money for a transaction. And so that is pretty much it. So with DocuSign or any other electronic signatures, once you've placed all your fields and filled in all your information, then you send it and it shoots it over to them for them to click to sign everything. So questions?
That's good, Chad. Yeah, I appreciate you taking all the time to go through that. I'm sure I'll have questions once I go back to the process in the real world, but to have a working knowledge now, of looking at it instead of the first time you got a client, you're looking at
No, that's hard.
You don't even know what you're looking at. So now, I kind of went through this at a blur,
Right.
before.
Yeah. So y'all don't know this. Guy wrote an offer the other day, and it was just kind of a whirlwind situation with a really tight time frame to get an offer in, with multiple offers, and they had a short deadline, and so we were jumping through hoops trying to get it done, and there really wasn't any teaching time there to kind of go through this and learn what it's, you know, so it was,
It was kind of, yeah, it was kind of like on the job training, right? 'Cause-
yeah.
And Chad was just, he was like Chad on the spot. I mean, like did not hesitate, jumped in. He was trying to get me through it, and I was trying to get through these forms. But you know, the thing about it is I like the way you presented it on this DocuSign because you know, when we were doing it, I don't have this. And so I need
Right.
to get the DocuSign or whatever.
Well,
that-
and there are so many different options, whether you choose DigiSign, which is part of SkySlope, and it's pretty easy to use. And it is only like 35 bucks a year, I think, or something like that.
Okay.
Remine is offered by the Association of Realtors and it's free.
Okay.
DocuSign, I think I pay $240 a year for it.
Yeah.
And listen, I use it just because I was using it for years and it's just what I'm used to. And I've got my templates set like I like them and stuff like that. It doesn't mean it's better than any of the other ones. It's just what I'm using.
I think that's important. So whatever you do start out with, which would be me, what am I going to choose?
Yeah.
Get your templates ready.
Yeah.
Then you go and you say, I just start filling them out because I didn't have that. And I was trying to convert these to Word documents.
Yeah.
And then botched all the blanks up and everything. Because when
Yeah,
you got
and in the future with that, you need something that helps you, that some sort of program on your computer that you can fill in PDFs with if you're doing it outside of something like this instead of converting it to Word, because that just jacks up the formatting.
Yeah, so that was one of the big complications that I ran into was either convert your PDFs, get a DocuSign or something, just to streamline that process. But again, going back over these with you actually digging into it makes so much more sense to me now.
Yeah.
When I see it again, you know, I could actually probably have a working knowledge of talking through this better.
Sure.
So,
Well,
so
and
very
going
valuable.
through it one time like this doesn't mean that you're going to have a full grasp of everything in it, but this just gives you an overview. And then from here, you can read. I encourage all of y'all to read back through all of these things
Yeah.
and really get familiar with them, and maybe just jot down what your confusions or questions are on certain ones. And then from there, it's just going to be running into real world scenarios. And
Yeah.
we're always here to help y'all through those.
Yeah.
So this isn't to take the place of us helping you do an offer by any means, but it's to help you understand it better as you're explaining it, or you can get one started and then we can jump in and help you fill in the
That's what
blank.
I'm saying. At least if with this, I can go ahead and get started and then you
Yeah.
can jump in and say, hey, I say, I got a question about this right
Yeah.
here. I gotta, you know, if they ask me about that, what's the proper way to respond or what do I need to mark on this section here based on what I learned from them? So it'll just be an easier conversation now that you've gone through this with you when I get started and with the client, you know, if I start working with them. So this is very valuable.
Good. Well, I would encourage all of you to kind of look into what digital signature platform do you want to use, and go ahead and play around with it so that the first time you need to send something, you're not scrambling going, oh crap, I don't even know how to do this. And I mean, look, it happens to all of us. I mean, and it does with everybody. You're drinking from the fire hose, just trying to figure out what does it even mean to be a realtor, and you haven't had a reason to have that yet. So it happens with everybody, but I think it's important that, you know, kind of figure that out and decide which one do you want to use. Start with one of the free ones. I mean, Remine works pretty good. And then if you don't like it, move on from there.
And you guys may know this, but I looked on, I went to the website there and I didn't know, I couldn't find it on the Remine.
So Remine, hold on, let me, in Paragon,
Yeah.
let me move everybody out of the way. Let's see.
I had trouble finding it too,
I'm about to show
but,
you exactly where it is.
but I did find it. And I think there's a video, but it doesn't explain it to me that well, but there is a class offered.
Yeah, there are
coming up.
classes. Either, I mean, you can go in person or do it on Zoom, I think. So under up here at the top, can you see my cursor?
Yeah.
Click on resources. Whoops.
Mhm.
And then go over here, and it's right here under property data resources.
Oh,
And
Remine under
yeah.
the,
And it's right there. And it's I don't know the first time you do it, I guess it'll log you in automatically. I don't know. And you just go in and set up your stuff. You know, what I've found is it's pretty cool. I've done it a couple of times. You just click on this Docs Plus thing is the electronic signature part of it, which my thing tries to block, and I have to click on it to open that up. Okay. And you just go in here and you can create a transaction. When you sell you're doing you're doing a sale, it's the buy side. Next step, you can put in the transaction details and it pops all that stuff in there. And then you can pull from there's a forms library where you can already pull the stuff, most of the stuff you need in there. But if something you don't need is there, you can upload it as a PDF, you know, so it's pretty friendly. I've used it a couple of times. Like DocuSign's not real good for me filling stuff out if I need to fill it out and print it because sometimes I need, like I've got a 80-year-old that doesn't want to do electronic signatures and I need to go sit at the kitchen table with them.
Yeah.
You know, then I a couple of times I've gone into Remine and filled everything out and printed it, because if I print it from DocuSign, it's going to have a big in process watermark across the middle of it and stuff. You know, I would play around with that and see how you like it just because it's free. But like I said, DigiSign, which is part of SkySlope, is only like 35 bucks a year. You know, and I haven't played around with it a lot, but I did a while back. I played around with it a little bit and it was pretty easy.
All
So you
right.
just pick what you like. I mean, I've changed a couple of times over the years. I did DocuSign. I did .loop for a while, and then I switched back to DocuSign because I got mad because Zillow bought .loop and I didn't want Zillow getting my money. So
Well, I've used DocuSign a lot with just a prior career,
Yeah.
but
and there is a realtor version of it. If you want to use it, go to National Association of Realtors, or maybe I can find the link. I don't know, but there's a realtor version of it, and it's like 240 bucks a year, I think.
well,
But 240 is a
Okay.
lot more than free.
yeah, I was gonna say, since I haven't really sold anything yet, I might
Yeah.
go the free route. if I
Yeah,
get-
I absolutely do as much free as you can do.
And if I can learn that, you know, that's good. So that gives me a path to take and try to, and I guess I could just create a dummy one and just practice with it,
Yeah.
all that. So yeah, that'd be good.
Yeah, just go in there and set one up and, you know, maybe recreate the one you just wrote the other day or something and play around with it, because then you've got real world terms and stuff to pop in
Yeah.
there and play around with. Do one and send it to your wife to sign it or something, you
Yeah.
know, just finalize
Right.
one and send it to her, and then you can see what it looks like on the other end so you can explain it to people.
Great idea. Okay. Thank you.
February the 21st is the Remind class. I signed up for it to see what
Okay.
that was like.
Great.
Awesome. Thank you, Lynn.
All
Thank
right,
y'all.
guys, if y'all don't have any other questions, I'm gonna jump off of here. We gotta run to Homewood and get some video made of a new listing and let the photographer in.
Good. Well, good luck with that. And
And as y'all are kind of processing all this, just jot down your questions and hit me with them, and we'll revisit it. And we'll do this. I think it's important. I think we'll start doing this kind of thing, you know, whether it's every week or every couple of weeks or something. Just take a different topic and run through it. You know, maybe we'll do a buyer's net sheet, or, you know, at some point do listing agreement, you know, stuff like that.
Very
Chad,
helpful.
you recorded this, so will that be
Yep.
posted somewhere?
I'll send it to y'all.
That'd be great, because I'd love to go back and have that as a resource.
Sure. Yep.
Thank
All right.
you.
Thank
All
you
right,
very
guys.
much.
Y'all have a great day.
You too.
You
Bye-bye
too.
now.
Bye.